Hey there, I'm the Madcatster. Am I glad to see you here? Well, today we're doing something a little different, and we're going to take a trip back to old Hollywood in the first of our Hollywood true crime series. And today we're going to talk about the mysterious death of Thelma Todd, who was a famous actress back in the 20s and 30s. And to this day, the true story behind her death has not been uncovered, but there is one tantalizing version that comes from a credible source that was recounted before this person died that may actually explain rationally what happened. So I'm going to talk to you about it. We're going to talk about Thelma Todd. Let's get into it. So the name Thelma Todd may or may not be familiar to you. Of course, she died back in 1935, so it's been a long time since she's actually been a household name. But back in the day, in the 20s and 30s, Thelma star rose very high and she became famous across the country and probably around the world for her beauty, her wit, her expertise at being a comedic actress, but she did also star in some um, dramas as well, where she had critical acclaim. She was considered to be very bright, very personable, and to be very energetic, vivacious person. So when Thelma was found slumped over the steering wheel of her Lincoln automobile in the garage where she parked it one Monday morning by her maid, who also served basically as her driver and would drive her to the studio every day, people didn't know what to think. They didn't know whether it was that she had ended her own life, that it was foul play, an accident. It wasn't really clear what had happened. She was fully dressed in evening wear that she had worn out to a dinner party slash nightclub event at the very famous, now no longer existing in true Hollywood fashion, long since torn down. It was very famous at the time. It was called the Trocadero Club. And believe it or not, when I was younger, we took a trip to Florida. And I'm sorry to digress, but there's always something that connects me to these stories. We went to Disney World when I was a kid, and in the gift shop at, I think it was at Universal Studios. It was like when Universal Studios was like really new, and they had like a gift shop with Hollywood memorabilia. They had this brick there and it had a brass plaque on it, and it said Troc Rock, and it was a brick from the steps of the Trocadero nightclub slash supper club. This very same club that they, I guess, took when they were tearing it down, and they were selling the pieces, the little bricks off as souvenirs. So even at that age, I was fascinated by old Hollywood and I was fascinated by historic buildings. And it just was like everybody else wanted, the Jaws t shirts and all the other Hollywood stuff. And I wanted this brick. That's what I wanted. So that's my connection to this story. So, anyways, she'd gone out to this dinner party at the Trocadero nightclub and had come home very late, and she was still wearing, when she was found Monday morning, this was, that was Saturday night and this was Monday morning. She was still wearing the exact same outfit that her maid had helped her put on when she went out. So let's start with her early life. So Thelma Todd was born on July 29th, 1906, in a mill city called Lawrence, Massachusetts, which was a very industrial town, and it like suffered the fate, unfortunately, of so many mill towns that the mills, when they closed, put a lot of people out of work, and the cities went into decline. So, Thelma was born to into a very, I guess you could say, working class family. Her father actually had come over from Ireland, so he was a obviously first generation immigrant that came over, and Thelma's mother had actually come down from Canada. So both of her parents were born in different countries. So Thelma was like, the American story. So Todd's parents, clearly in search of that American dream, had come down. And so she was born. Her father actually had some bit of success because He did go on to get involved in city government, so he clearly had pulled himself up from just being simply a laborer to being in government, which I think for that time was a pretty significant thing. So anyway, so Thelma had an older brother who unfortunately died when he was young. He died in 1910 in an accident. And so then Thelma was an only child. She was considered to be naturally very beautiful. She was extremely intelligent. She did very well in school. And when she was in high school, she had done some modeling for a local clothing store for fashion shows that were held at a local theater. And in 1925, Thelma had been encouraged to, some say by her mother, because her mother was one of those, the stereotypical stage mother. Well, that was Thelma's mother, Alice. So Alice apparently really had encouraged Thelma to take part in these beauty contests, and she ended up becoming Miss Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1925. And then she went on to compete statewide the same year and won Miss Massachusetts. And then was, eligible to go off to Miss America. But what happened apparently was, they noticed how beautiful she was, and as a result of her winning the Miss Massachusetts title, she was invited to go to Paramount Studios, had like an acting school in Queens, New York, because believe it or not, back then there was a lot of film production in New York. And there's still some, but so Paramount had a school there that aspiring actors and actresses could head out to there and see, if they were good enough to make the cut and then maybe get a job in Hollywood. So at the time, Thelma had enrolled at what was then called the Normal School, which was the teaching college at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell, which still exists, but it's not just a teaching college anymore. But she had dropped out after the first year to pursue other things, obviously. So Thelma ended up being one of the most successful students sent off to the school in that group of that class, and ended up getting offered a contract out in Hollywood. So off she went. How did she become the star that she was? Well, let's talk about Thelma's career. So in the 1920s, silent films were still the norm. I mean, there was no such thing as a sound picture with talking actors and actresses. And they used to actually, for those of you who aren't familiar with how a silent film worked, and Mr. Shady's not that old that I remember silent films, so don't even start with the wisecracks. But what they would do is, back then theaters, there was a theater with one screen, and you could only see one movie at a time. They didn't have these megaplexes. But silent films were accompanied by music, and they actually played live music with either a piano player, sometimes an orchestra, or a band would play, and that was the soundtrack. And they would put up what's called a title card, where they would show like the dialogue of the actors. You'd see the actor talk, then they put up the dialogue card, so you knew what they were saying. So that's how a silent film worked. And as we know, obviously, films really became very successful all over the world, and people just became, obsessed. And back then, when we didn't have all these entertainment options and the electronics and everything, going to the movies was like a big deal. It was like the highlight of your week or month or however often you were lucky enough to be able to scrape up the money to go. And movie stars they were much more idolized than they are today. I mean, they were like gods. And they were, that's these people who, a lot of them came from nothing, were able to go out to Hollywood, and through their talent in the silent pictures were able to catapult themselves to megastars. And that was the age of when we truly had movie stars. I don't consider this is just my opinion, but I don't consider any of today's actors to be anywhere in that league. There's that old Hollywood and today's Hollywood are so far apart that, yes, they're famous, but they're more celebrities than anything. Back then, they were like idolized. I don't think we have that today. I don't think we idolize people in that same way, or that they have that same presence that they had. So anyway, so it was a big deal. So of course, back then in the early days of pictures, they were pulling people from all walks of life. And so it was truly a possibility that you could get discovered and become successful. So, of course, a lot of people flocked to Hollywood to try to make it in the motion picture industry. Naturally, the bulk of them did not succeed. You know, some they either got bit roles or they got extra roles, but they never went anywhere. And then some were who were lucky enough. Edith is here. Hi, Edith. Some who were lucky enough to actually become successful enough to have a career, and they didn't all become big stars, but some of them, they were able to make a decent living at it. Those people were the fortunate ones. And then there were those who were the megastars. But unfortunately, in the late 20s, when sound films started to make their appearance, a lot of the actors and actresses who were performing as silent stars didn't have a voice that translated well enough into talking films, so that their careers literally were snuffed out overnight as talking pictures became the norm. And it didn't happen all at once. It was sort of like there was a mix for a while before slowly sound films were phased out and talking films became the only films. So a lot of people's careers ended because they couldn't present themselves well in front of a camera in a talking film. Thelma was very lucky. Thelma had a very good voice for talking films. So Thelma, even though she wasn't a big actress when talking films started to make their appearance, she had a good voice. She was beautiful. So she got even more notice. And so she got roles in talking pictures. They were small at first, but more and more, she was noted for her ability as a comedic actress and how talented she was at executing her lines and just, really shining in these comedy pictures. So as a consequence, she got offered lots of roles in comedy shorts. They were called shorts back then. Nowadays, I don't know if you've ever heard the term. I mean, I think they still use it. Feature film. A feature film was a long, full-length movie. And what would happen was they would play what were called newsreels, which would give you like the news of the day. Because remember, back then there was no TV. So you got your news from the newspaper. Or when the films were released, they would put out these regular newsreels and they'd play those at the beginning. And they would have like headlines and, video footage, film footage from events around the world. And they would play those. Then there would be the shorts. And the shorts were usually like comedy shorts, and they'd be like, Laurel and Hardy before. I don't know if you guys are familiar with them. I'm sure many of you are because they're still very famous. But Laurel and Hardy, before they started making full-length movies, made shorts, and there were a lot of people that made shorts, and there was a few studios that did that. Like Charlie Chaplin, his movies, he started out in shorts before he made some longer pictures, and Buster Keaton. There were these people called the Keystone Cops. Then there were the Three Stooges, actually, I believe, started as shorts as well. And there was Laurel and Hardy. So Thelma got cast in some of the Laurel and Hardy shorts, and she did so well that she made a lot of them. One person who's like considered like the king of the shorts was a man named Hal Roach. And he was one of the big directors out there and producers, and he actually had his own studio, the Hal Roach Studios. He was the person who was responsible for people like Laurel and Hardy. So Thelma had been working for him and had become more and more successful in these shorts. And then she was noticed by Paramount Pictures, and they signed her to a contract, and she started making full-length or longer-length films. So as her career continued, she did take some serious roles. She didn't just do comedy. She also, believe it or not, she did some gothic horror films, which I haven't seen any of her horror films. I don't know if they exist still, but I have seen her do comedy, and she's really, really very funny. And she ended up in 1931 making a feature film called Corsair, which was directed by a man named Roland West. And it was a serious role, and they actually changed her name on the credits because they didn't want people to see Thelma Todd and think, oh, comedy, or not want to see her in a serious role. So they called her Allison Lloyd. So, but she did very well. The picture wasn't like a huge smash, but she definitely showed her talent, and she was, she was very well received in that particular film. She then, while they were filming, began an affair with Roland West. So she became involved with Roland West, and although he was married, I believe, still at the time, to his wife, Jewel Carmen, who was, I guess you'd call her a wannabe actress. She wasn't very successful, but they were basically estranged at the time. So their marriage was falling apart anyways, and she began an affair with him. We'll talk about her personal life in a minute, but let's finish talking about her career. So she was actually so popular that the studio would lend her out to other films, which was common practice back then, where you were under a contract to a studio, but they would lend you out and they would make some money from that. And of course, the actor would make money. And that's how the system worked. And so in 1931, she made Corsair, which was a full-length feature. And in fact, also in 1931, she was in the original version of the movie The Maltese Falcon, before Humphrey Bogart made it very famous. So, clearly she had talent. So due to her increasing popularity and fame, Hal Roach created a series of short comedic films specifically for Thelma Todd, and also for another actress named Zazu Pitts, who, despite the exotic sound of her name, was actually from Connecticut. So they were paired up together and basically to become the female Laurel and Hardy. And they're very successful. And in fact, she made 17 27-minute comedic, they called them slapstick comedies, and they were talking pictures with Zazu Pitts. This series of films was extremely popular, and Thelma's star continued to ascend. Zazu Pitts decided to leave the duo, and another actress named Patsy Kelly took her place, and they went on to make 21 short comedy films together. Up to the time of her death, she was still making comedy films with Patsy Kelly, but she also was making some feature films, including several of the Marx Brothers' more famous full-length films, which actually 3 of them were released after her death. One was called The Bohemian Girl, and another was called Horse Feathers. There was also one that was called Monkey Business she did with them. So she was basically at the high point of her career in 1935, and I'm sure would have continued to act. Now, in 1935, Thelma turned 29, and she knew that, in that business in Hollywood, even back then, that as you aged, especially for women, it was very, I know, stereotypical and unfortunate, but you became less bankable the older you got. So knowing that, her Hollywood career days were numbered, the year before she died in 1934, she went into business with Roland West and his ex-wife, I think it was by that time, Jewel Carmen, and they bought what was known as Thelma Todd's Sidewalk Cafe. And it still exists, and I'm going to show you in just a second the film of me. When I was just out in Los Angeles, I went to it and filmed it, and it looks exactly the same as it did in 1935 when Thelma was still running it. And she had an apartment above the restaurant, because it was, I believe it was like 3 levels altogether. They had like a band stand and dance floor in part of it that was like a nightclub run by Jewel Carmen. I think it was called Joya. So here's my footage of the actual restaurant. So the building you see across the street behind me was known back in the 1930s as Thelma Todd's Roadside Cafe. And it was owned by comedic actress and very famous actress Thelma Todd. So as you can see, and I put up pictures here of what it looked like in 1935, it looks pretty much exactly the same. And there are steps. It's like on a steep hillside overlooking the ocean.
Back in the day, if they weren't made out of concrete like this, they would have been hard to navigate, especially if you were intoxicated and at night. And I've got some lizard friends.
Roland West had built this huge house, which still exists, up above the restaurant, and his ex-wife, lived there. But Thelma kept her car in the garage, which was down. It's really weird, and I actually went to the scene of the crime, and we'll get to that in a minute. But it's the house is set up, but the garage is like on a different street. It's like behind the house, down at the level of another street, while the house is sort of up a bit and fronts onto a different street. So Thelma would keep her car there because there was no garage space at the restaurant where she was living, and Roland West supposedly was living with her. Although, if you read contemporary accounts back then, there were people who disputed that. They claimed they were only friends and blah blah blah, which for the most part we know is not true. And they were together as a couple. So Thelma was, as I said earlier, she was very vivacious, and she got two nicknames that people used for her. One was the ice cream blonde. I don't know where the term ice cream comes from, but she obviously didn't have naturally platinum blonde hair, so she bleached her hair. So she was known as the ice cream blonde. And her other nickname was Hot Toddy. And a hot toddy, if you're not familiar, is actually a drink made, I think it's with brandy. So those were her two nicknames. She was known as the Ice Cream Blonde and Hot Toddy. Hot Toddy came from the fact that she was very effervescent, and the fact that she enjoyed going out and she liked to be with people and party. But some people call her a party girl, and I hate that term. I don't think she was a party girl so much as she just socialized a lot. It's we have a different connotation, I think, of what a party girl is nowadays. And but she had a very active social life. She was a big name in Hollywood. She knew a lot of famous people. She's reputed to have had connections with alleged mobster Lucky Luciano. Some people have theorized his alleged involvement in her death, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Before she had met Roland West, she briefly had been married to a man named Pat DiCicco, who was a Hollywood agent and reputed small-time gangster, although, there's some question about that. And their relationship was very contentious. Apparently, it was very, very volatile, let's say. And they were married for only about 2 years, and they got divorced. And it was after that Thelma met Roland West and started an affair with him that would last until she died. So they started the Sidewalk Cafe because Thelma wanted to have something to bank on for the future, some sort of means of making an income, obviously, when her movie offers started to fade away. And she was being very smart. She was being very prepared. Thelma's mother had also followed her out to Hollywood, and she was very involved in Thelma's career. At one point, Thelma signed a contract, I guess not too long before she died, a new contract that she had to stay, and this is gross. This to me is just so gross. She couldn't gain more than 5 pounds, or she would be terminated. It's just so gross. It's just so gross. Nowadays, I mean, you look at it and go, oh my God. So, apparently, allegedly, Thelma's mother was tasked with making sure Thelma stayed on target for her weight, and I guess she got started on, back then they were called prescription diet pills. I think they were amphetamines, basically, is what they were. And people like Judy Garland, who also were given them, not for weight issues, but for in terms of to keep her energy level up for her terrible schedule of filming. But so Thelma, anyways, that's kind of incidental. So this has nothing to do with her death. But so Thelma was really cruising along in 1935 at the age of 29. She had her business. It was very popular with the Hollywood set. It was a good place for tourists to go, if they wanted to do a little star spotting. And it sounds like, from what I've read, that it wasn't making much money or no money at that point. But, it was only 2 years old. So it's not uncommon for a restaurant at that point to be like that. But anyway, so she and Roland West were sharing the apartment above that building. So on the night of her death, now we'll get to the mystery part of it. So on the night of December 14th, 1935, Thelma was invited to this party being thrown at the Trocadero nightclub. And she got dressed up in a beautiful gown with a mink coat and they say about $20,000 worth of jewelry. And she, at that point, was being driven by people because several years earlier, she liked to imbibe a little bit. She had gotten cited for not only speeding, but for driving under the influence, and it crashed her car into a palm tree. And so the studio forbade her from driving. So her maid would show for her in her own car. The maid would go up, get the car, come down, pick Thelma up in the morning, take her to the studio for the day. But when she would go out to other events, a different car would come with the driver, and he would take her places. So the driver came and picked her up and took her off to the Trocadero. And from all accounts, Thelma had a good time. There was nothing unusual. In fact, she had invited people around the next day for dinner to her restaurant, and some of her friends. And she apparently had a little bit too much to drink. And so Sid Grauman, who actually, if you've ever heard of the Chinese theater in Hollywood, it was Sid Grauman who built the Chinese theater, but they were friends. And so Sid Grauman called Roland West at the restaurant and said, Thelma's leaving now. And this was like around 3:00-ish, and to let him know, that she was on her way. So the driver took her and drove her home. And normally he would walk her up, because there was a separate entrance to the apartment from the outside. He would walk her up the steps to the apartment door and leave her there and then go, just to make sure she got in okay. Well, on this night, she told him, you don't need to walk me up, because I guess from what I understand, she was anticipating a blow up with Roland West, because before she left for the party, Roland West had said, you better be home by 2. And basically Thelma said, go screw yourself. And so she anticipated there was going to be a bit of a blow up, and she didn't want the chauffeur to have to be witness to that. So she told him, no, I'll walk up. That's where what we know to be absolutely true ends. Then the next day, on Sunday, the 15th, her friends did come around for dinner at the restaurant, but Thelma was nowhere to be found. No one had seen her allegedly since the previous evening. Roland West claimed that she never came home. And so nobody really knew what happened to Thelma. And it's really weird, because people had said that, Roland West, I guess, was very protective of her, or possessive, I would think is the better term. And so, it was kind of strange that he wasn't calling around looking for her, or, going out of his way. So, we don't know. But on Monday morning, Thelma's maid went up to get the car like she always did. And when she went into the garage, she found Thelma slumped over the steering wheel. The ignition was on, but the battery had died, and Thelma was dead. So she went back down and got Roland West. They went up. They verified Thelma was dead. There's some haze about what happened, but it was 45 minutes, I think, before they ended up phoning for the police to come and the medical examiner. And I guess they shifted her body, but she was still fully dressed in what she had worn. There were no outward signs of any physical injury to her. And so, it looked like either an accident or that she had taken her own life. Now, I read one part where the window in the garage supposedly was open, which is kind of weird, but we'll get to weird in a few minutes, because there's weirder. But they came, of course, and took her away, and they did an autopsy, and they determined that, carbon monoxide was the cause of death, and that it was they couldn't decide whether it was foul play or an accident or that it was intentional. So Thelma's mother was alerted, and Thelma's mother came before they took the body away, and she was, screaming basically that someone had murdered her. And so this is where like all these theories about the mob wanted to do away with her because supposedly Lucky Luciano wanted to use her upstairs as an illegal gambling operation, and she was having none of it. And so, there was some talk about maybe a mob hit, and it's just like, I'll talk about it in a minute, but I don't really think that I think that's just a lot of, mad theory mongering. But anyway, so Thelma, they convened what's known as an inquest, which they do in terms of like an unexplained or suspicious death, and they take testimony and evidence, and they try to determine what the actual cause of death was. And so, people testified there was no apparent signs that she would want to do this herself, and outwardly from the way the scene was and the way that evening had gone, there was no indication that she had any intention of this happening. And in fact, I guess there were like over 100 wrapped Christmas presents in the trunk of her car. So after all the testimony, and there was conflicting testimony, as there will be, and the evidence was very confusing. So basically what they decided is that it was carbon monoxide, and it was either, it was sort of an accident, but possible that she did it herself. But I think the prevailing assumption was it was an accidental thing. And there were several theories that have been put forward. Oh, by the way, so you see, I'm going to show you now footage I took of, it's very short, but footage I took of the actual crime scene. It's exactly the way it was in 1935, and I'll show you some pictures so you can compare. I'm talking about like the garage doors are the same garage doors that were there in 1935, and the sign above the garage, it's the same. It's all like the house has not changed, and it literally is the same garage. They've changed nothing, and you'll see that in the pictures because they're very distinctive doors with these like square within a square type exterior of the door, surface of the door. So it's exactly the same. So I went up this twisting road and filmed the garage because I really wanted to go to the actual scene. And that is where she was found, in that garage right there. That is where Thelma Todd was found dead, right there. And I did go up like the steps that she allegedly had to walk up to get there. They've changed it a bit so that part of the path she took you can no longer cross because I think it's owned by the state. And I think it's for electrical power reasons. So, but I did go up, part way up the steps to where I could. The steps have changed. All that's different. But so allegedly she'd gone up the steps to get to the car. And this brings me to the first theory. So the first theory is that Thelma came home drunk. She didn't have her key, couldn't get in. Roland West had previously locked her out before when she didn't come home when he wanted her home. But when it had happened the time before, she had actually thrown a rock through the window and let herself in. So, clearly Thelma was a very feisty person. And so this is why this theory bothers me. So they claim that she came home. He either wouldn't let her in, or he claims he didn't hear her, he says, and that she decided to go up to the car and sit in the car and started to stay warm because it was unusually cold, I guess, that December night, and it was like in either the 20s or it was like about 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So they theorized that she went upstairs, got in the car, started the car to stay warm. Now, it was an open-top car, so first of all, that's a little weird. So I've always found that theory problematic. It just didn't fit Thelma's personality. Like, I really think she would have made quite a fuss if she had gotten home and he wouldn't let her in. I think the whole neighborhood probably, there weren't a lot of houses back then, but I think that it would have reverberated off the hillsides if she couldn't get into her apartment, or she would have broken the window again. So I've always found that to be very problematic. What's always bothered me is that nobody bothered to go look to see if her car was missing. She'd gone out on the night of the 14th, basically came home very early in the morning on the 15th. So between very early morning on the 15th and the morning of the 16th, nobody bothered to look in the garage to see if her car was missing. I know she wasn't supposed to drive, but the keys, I guess, were always left in the car. So, and the garage wasn't locked. So she could have gone up there, gone into the garage, started the car, which clearly she did, and then taken the car somewhere. So it's weird to me that nobody ever checked. And that it wasn't until that following morning that her maid went and found her dead. The other theory was, as I was alluding to earlier, that it was a mob hit. But there were no signs of violence on her body, and the cause of death clearly was carbon monoxide poisoning. So I've always thought that theory was just ridiculous. So I discounted that theory. So then it comes to, what happened? Did she really go up to the garage, close the garage door, get in the car, start the car, and sit there to stay warm and then die of carbon monoxide poisoning? That just never sat with me. So recently I read an article by these authors who wrote a book about this incident a few years ago. And they, in the course of their research of Thelma's life and death, had actually interviewed, believe it or not, Hal Roach, the guy that was the head of the studio where she did her comedy shorts. And he was 90 years old at the time, but after pressuring him for quite a while, they were able to finally get him to do an interview with them. And he gives a version of events that, to me, makes the most sense. It's like, when I first read that, I went, oh my God, yeah, that is perfectly explains the whole situation. So what did he have to say? Well, I'm going to read you now what his version of what happened that night is, and then you tell me if it makes sense. Oh, by the way, they found the key to the apartment in her purse. Her maid had put the key in her purse, and it was still there. So again, this whole thing about she came home and couldn't get in, it's just ridiculous, you know? I mean, she must have known the key was there. Why would she have gone and not raised holy hell when she, A, had a key, and B, when she was not known to be a quiet person, and then go up, turn on her car, close the door, and sit in the garage to stay warm? It makes no sense. And like I said, there was no evidence that she intended to harm herself. So nothing makes sense. Okay, just the whole scene just doesn't make sense. So let's talk about what Hal Roach had to say. So there have also been some conflicting accounts over the years in the press, that people claiming that she had a broken nose and cracked ribs and bruises, and that, you know, that pointed to the fact that she was killed by someone. And apparently that's not really true. That in the autopsy, they did not find any signs of physical injury. And I think what's happening is her car accident from several years before, when she was told to stop driving, she had injured herself like in those ways. She had cracked ribs, I believe, and a broken nose, etc. And I think there's some confusion that these things are getting amalgamated together and getting conflated. So in reality, according to the autopsy, there was no signs of physical injury to her, and that the only thing that they were able to determine was carbon monoxide poisoning. The article is basically an excerpt from a book by a man named Marvin J. Wolfe and a woman named Catherine Mader. And they are the ones who actually were able to physically interview Hal Roach, the former studio head that Thelma Todd worked for. And he was able to give them what he says is the true account, allegedly, of what happened that night. And I'm going to read to you from this so that you can hear, because it's basically they're quoting what he said. And I'll put a link to the original article down below for you. So this is what Hal Roach had to say. He said West was very possessive, very controlling. He told Thelma she was to be back by 2 a.m. She said she'd come and go as she pleased, which sounds like her to me. They had an argument about it, and then she left for the party. And then when Sid Grauman called and told Roland West that she was on her way home, he says that West went into her apartment and he locked her out because he wanted to teach her a lesson. And apparently when she returned at almost 4 a.m., she declined her chauffeur's offer to walk her upstairs because she knew there would be a scene with West. When she found the door locked, she shouted at him, and they had another argument through the door, shouted at Roland West. West told her he didn't want her going to so many parties. Todd, who was still a bit drunk, screamed that she'd go to any party she pleased. She was invited to one later that day at Mrs. Wallace Ford's, and she said she'd just go to that party now. And according to Hal Roach, she climbed the steps of the garage. Roland West followed her, and when he arrived at the garage, Thelma was already in the car. She had started the engine, and so he ran around and locked the garage door, and apparently it locked from the outside, so it couldn't be unlocked from the inside. He was going to teach her a lesson. She wasn't going anywhere. He allegedly didn't think about the fact that he was locking her in and there was a running car, maybe assuming she'd turn it off. I don't know. So he apparently went back to bed. Nice guy, huh? Hal Roach says that when morning came, Roland West went back to the garage to let her out because he felt she'd been punished long enough. And when he unlocked the garage and went in, he found her dead. And so he panicked, did not know what to do. So he shut the garage door, left it unlocked, went back to the restaurant, and went about his business. Which, I know it sounds bizarre, but, I can believe it. This guy sounds like a real a-hole. And again, he was apparently so possessive, but yet he was not like calling her mother or inquiring about where she might be or looking for her. And so some people thought that was a little strange. So the way the story goes is then he just basically waited until the maid went and found her dead. And he apparently was extremely guilt-ridden, which of course he would be. He's responsible for her death. And I guess his life really went downhill from there. He tried to run the cafe without her, but after a few years it closed. And he never apparently directed again, from what I understand. And just basically until his death, and I think he died in 1961. Until he died, I guess he just was never the same. And understandably so. I mean, that was pretty traumatic. Even though he was responsible, I'm sure it's still, if it wasn't intentional, especially, I'm sure he was extremely upset by it. So I think that to me, knowing all of the facts and the evidence, hearing that really kind of ties everything together and makes sense. You know what I mean? The fact that the key was in her purse, the fact that she was in the garage and didn't, bother to open the door or whatever. And I think maybe that's why the window was open. Maybe she was trying to air out the garage. I don't know. But, it probably was just so much exhaust going in that wasn't enough to keep it at bay. So, while she was sitting there, she may have left the car running to stay warm, but decided, I better open the garage window. I don't know. But you tell me in the comments what you think. But I think this whole he locked her in to teach her a lesson thing makes sense. And she was invited to a party the next day. And she may have just been drunk enough that she thought, screw him. I'm going to go get in the car and go. Even though she's not supposed to be driving. And like I had said, the keys were in the car. So, there was no question with the garage unlocked and the keys there that she certainly had access to and the ability to start the car. But after this happened, in the aftermath of this, they convened a grand jury, and the grand jury determined, like I said, that most likely it was accidental, with the possibility it could be self-inflicted, but it sounds like they mostly lean towards it was just an accident. And that's basically where they left it. But in the aftermath of this, before the grand jury was convened, apparently Hal Roach was visited by the sheriff, and Roland West apparently had confessed to him what he had done. You have to understand the way Hollywood and Los Angeles were back then. You know, it wasn't the sprawling metropolis it is today, and there was a lot of corruption. And I'm sure you've seen movies about back in that period where there was just so much corruption. The studios had a lot of power, and over the press, over the police, over politicians, because they were the driving economic force. So they wielded a lot of power, and stars were regularly getting into trouble, and it was the studio's job to keep their bankable stars as free of scandal as possible. And so there was a lot of heavy-handedness by the studios and payoffs and things to keep everything quiet when something would come up. So there had also been a couple of really big murder scandals in the past several years. And so it makes sense to me that, sure, I mean, I can see the sheriff going to the head of the studio where she worked and saying, this director has confessed to her murder. What do you want us to do about it? And basically what he said to them was, he didn't do it on purpose. He's going to get the best lawyers. He'll never go to jail. And they basically left it at that. And it's as funky as that might sound back in that day, that also, to me, in my opinion, this is all my opinion, of course, that all makes sense. To me, Hal Roach, I don't think he has anything to gain by making this up. Granted, he was a lot older, but apparently still lucid, so I don't see any reason. It's not like at the age of 90, when he's got this career, he's already, got a legacy, why he would suddenly just make this story up. And the fact that he was reluctant at first to talk to them, also, in my opinion, this sounds like a credible solution to the whole issue of why Thelma Todd was sitting in her car with her party clothes on, the garage door shut, and why she was dead. Because nothing else makes any sense. She had a key. She didn't make a fuss. She sat in the car with the motor running, with the garage door unlocked. So why, why didn't she take the car or go to her mother's, because her mother didn't live far away? Nothing made sense to me when I first had read about this mystery. And so after her death, of course, it was big news, and her funeral was held at the Pierce Brothers mortuary and funeral chapel in West Los Angeles. And of course, thousands of people came to the wake to see her. And she was then cremated, and her mother held on to her ashes until the 60s. And when her mother died, she had Thelma's ashes placed in her casket and buried with her. And here you can see video footage of me actually visiting the gravesite in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which is where she was born and raised. So we are at the gravesite of Thelma Todd. And she died in 1935, but she wasn't buried until 1969. She was cremated, and her mother, Alice, kept her ashes until she died. When she died in 1969, they were buried with her. We're at Bellevue Cemetery in Lawrence, Massachusetts. When I heard Hal Roach's version of what happened, I said, that all makes perfect sense. That ties everything together and explains, to me, in my opinion, the whole situation. So, I don't know, you guys. Is it solved? Do you think there's still more to the story that we're not hearing and that Hal Roach made all that up? Tell me down in the comments below. Let me know. Let me know what you think of the Hollywood mystery if you want to see more of these. I hope you guys enjoyed it. But that's the story of Thelma Todd. I think it's solved, but that's my opinion. You tell me yours. Thank you so much for joining me for this special edition. And You take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.